The beginning of the book describes the Madagascar election, or a Madagascar election. And it reads like a screenplay where a good hometown kid becomes like this horrible, corrupt dictator person who can't keep his hands off of power and money that's not his.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the weirder things that happened to me when I was doing my PhD, where I met the yogurt kingpin of Madagascar. And, he grew up selling yogurt off the back of his bicycle, became the richest man in Madagascar eventually, sort of fast forward a couple decades later, and decides he wants to be president. And, successfully becomes president. And then the short version of the story is he's overthrown in a coup d'etat by a 34-year-old radio DJ. There's bloodshed. And in that quick version of the story, what I'm skipping over is this sort of incremental change of becoming more corrupt over time, which is the archetypal example of power corrupting, right? So it's like he comes in as a reformer. He's got all these ideas. He sets up an anti-corruption agency. Then, he starts to try to sell half of Madagascar's arable land to a company to make money. He registers Air Force Two, as he calls the Madagascar presidential jet, to his personal, it's in his name.
That's so on brand for an African strongman too, right? Like, or any strongman, but to be like corny about it is just chef's kiss.
Yeah, and the thing is, it was weird writing about him because I like the guy on a personal level. Like I've met with him a bunch of times. There was one time, I don't write about this in Corruptible, but there was one time where he wanted advice from me, and his chief of staff texted me and says President Ravalomanana will be in Paris tomorrow. You will be in Paris tomorrow. I was just like, what do you mean? I live in London, so it's 2.5 hours on the train, but he's just like, just get there. So we had breakfast, and, he just reimbursed my train ticket, and that was it. It was just sort of and it's the mindset of some of these people of just sort of,
everyone works for me.
Yeah. And, it's a really weird story because he presided over massive economic growth when he was president, basically because he wanted the yogurt to get to various places faster. So he built all these roads, and it actually unleashed growth. So it's this weird story of a corrupt leader actually unleashing lots of economic potential. But anyway, I put him in the book at the beginning because he's this stereotypical example of grows up, humble beginnings, poor, has his sights set on power, gets it. And over time, the longer he's in office, the more he starts to sort of skirt the rules and break the rules. And ultimately, it caused his downfall. And the radio DJ, by the way, is still the president of Madagascar. So there you go.
Yeah, this type of story is extremely common. I studied a lot of Vladimir Putin over the last probably 10 years, reading every bio and book and every documentary about him. Now he's quite relevant, unfortunately. But back then it was just sort of like a pet thing of mine to study Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong Un, Vladimir Putin, Turkmenbashi, and all these other creeps. And a lot of them did come to power, to use the Putin example. And again, look, it's hard to tell what's true when you're looking at a propaganda machine. But one of the things he came in with, and I think even Bill Browder, who Putin has gone after, who was on episode number 2 of the show, Putin's thing was, hey, man, let's take down these oligarchs. These guys are buying everything up. It's really unfair. It's going to screw up the whole country. And so Vladimir Putin was the guy who would snipe an oligarch and take their stuff and redistribute it. And then he was like, why am I redistributing it to anybody but myself? And then now he's the chief oligarch of oligarchs, and he basically just replaced the guys that got there first with the guys that were friends with him. And it's hard to say if that was always the plan, but it's also possible that he went, no, I love Russia and we're going to make this right. And then he was like, screw it, I also like money a lot.
Yeah, I think they get a taste for it. I mean, I think power is the same way. I mean, the weird thing in these systems, and it's not always the case. I mean, it's certainly the case to an extent in, say, Western democracies, the U.S., et cetera. But in these systems, power and money are the same thing, because economic advantages are completely correlated with how close you are to the political center. So if you're the dictator's friend, you're going to get good business opportunities. You're going to be able to do well no matter what you could be totally incompetent, but you're going to get some state-owned enterprises and all this type of stuff.
Well, who's the second richest man in Russia is the conductor of the symphony orchestra who grew up with Vladimir Putin or something like that. I could be getting that wrong, but it's he owns an aluminum company or something, right?
Yeah, well, there's also the really rich cellist for the same reason.
That's who I'm talking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the taste they get for the trappings of power is difficult to go away from, especially when you've grown up like Mark Ravalomanana did, poor and, you know, in a sort of, well, I mean, Madagascar was about the 6th or 7th poorest country in the world. So, you know, you have nothing, and then you're all of a sudden extremely rich, jetting around, going to conferences, addressing the UN. I can see why psychologically that would, you know, really entice people. And that's why, like, I put him in as that, okay, here's the stereotypical power corrupts. This is what everybody thinks. And then the rest of the book is like, wait a minute, the story is way more complicated than that. And there's actually a lot of dynamics that are much more interesting than the standard script. And so that's where I, you know, go for the rest of the book.
Did you go to Madagascar for this?
Yeah. I've been to Madagascar 8 times actually. So
wow. Did you try the yogurt? That's the real question.
I have. Yeah. When I had breakfast with him in his sort of palatial home, you know, it was like this long table. I mean, it's like the Despot special they must have at like the furniture shop. Right?
They love those. They love those. Yeah.
So
see the photo of Macron talking to Putin? It's like
exactly.
17 feet long. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
So it's basically like this, and he's like filled it with breakfast food, including a ton of yogurt. And, you know, like, it's just 2 of us. There's like 2 seats. And I'm like, I felt super bad because I really wanted to interview him and like talk to him. So I wasn't planning to have like a big breakfast. So like I ate before I arrived.
Oh,
so
no.
he's got like, you know, like 10 plates of food. And I'm like, oh my God, like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. But he also had, I write about this in the book too, like this, he had this like shrine to Bethlehem that was like, the only way I can describe it is like a model train Bethlehem. So like a massive cross on the wall. And it's like Bethlehem, but there's like a train. It's like on a train scale. And it's just like in the middle of his house. And he just like showed it to me. It was like, oh yes, like this is my shrine to Bethlehem. And I was like, okay. You don't know how to react to that. So yeah.
Yeah. Meanwhile, people don't have like health care in other parts of Madagascar, but he's got this $58,000 or more scale model of Bethlehem in the living room to show to random dudes who don't care. Like, I'm not here for the yogurt. I'm just here to write a book. I assume he didn't know the book was called Corruptible and it was about this.
Well, I started the first time I interviewed him was like in 2012. So I was interviewing him for a variety of different things. I will say that I sent copies of the book to the people who come out a bit better, and Mark Ravalomanana did not receive a copy. I don't think he knows. I don't think he knows that he's in the book because like his chief of staff, super nice guy, but he like WhatsApped me like Happy New Year, and so he must not know.
Or it's like, Happy New Year. When are you coming to visit? We would love to see you. Yeah. The Lord Acton quote, "The absolute power corrupts absolutely." Is that whenever I see quotes like that are spread around so much, I always have to think, is that really what that person said, and what was the context? What were they talking about? Because they probably weren't like, you know what, people who run for elections in third world countries that get a lot of corruption. That's what I mean. This is a long time ago. What was he referring to?
Yeah, so Lord Acton is writing this letter as there's a debate raging about whether the abuses of the church in things like the Inquisition with loads of torture should be exposed, and people should talk honestly about it. And one of the guys is basically saying, no, like the duty is to protecting the faithful, so we should just basically keep covering this up and so on. And Lord Acton is trying to explain that as God-fearing men, they have more of a duty to expose the abuses in the church. And his argument is that power tends to corrupt. The tens often gets dropped in the quotation, but power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's what he's talking about, is how if you end up in a situation where church abuses are swept under the rug, it'll only get worse over time. So yeah, it's a real quote. What's interesting is that other people have said something like it a few different times, in fact, earlier than Lord Acton, but it just didn't catch on. And this is one of the things that happens with quotes, right? I mean, like, it's an idea that isn't probably the first time some human has thought of it. It just happens that Lord Acton's letter got some attention, and now it's the one that we turn to.
Okay, that makes sense. And they're talking about the Spanish Inquisition or something like that?
Yes, yeah, and that's why that chapter where, I describe some of the torture that was involved that they're basically covering up.
Yeah, I mean, some of the torture in this, they stretched people to death. They would like drop you from long distances with your arms tied with a rope, and there was like skull crushing devices. You can see these in museums. those lazy museums you see in tourist places where they're like torture museum, and there's like just 3 gross devices they found in the dungeon of the castle that you're looking at. And they were using that stuff back then. It's so horrific.
Yeah, I mean, the strappado is this horrible device where they basically raise you way up and then drop you, and then the rope bites right before you hit the ground, and they just keep doing that. And I mean, it's loads of forced confessions under torture and so on. And this is why I think, it's actually quite an apt quote for modern society in the sense that there is still this tendency around powerful people who are admired to, sweep the cobwebs under the rug, and just sort of say there's nothing wrong with them. We have these idols and we can't ever imagine they have blemishes. And one of the things that I tried to do in the book was show the complexity of people in power, because I sat down with some monstrous figures. I mean, war criminals, people who'd order torture, etc. And they're complicated individuals. And that's what I think Lord Acton is saying. He's saying, like, we can be proud of the church and still acknowledge that the church made mistakes. And that doesn't mean you have to throw the entire baby out with the bathwater. And I think the same is true with people in power. They're not all good or all bad. Sometimes powerful people who do awful stuff are trying their best and they end up making mistakes. Sometimes they're half awful and half good. And I think that's the complexity of leadership, is you like to put everything into a moral black or white box. And
Sure.
In my experience, it's not that clear cut.
So the question is, does power corrupt people, or does power simply attract people who are more likely to become corrupt, or some combination thereof?
Yeah, so this is the chicken or the egg problem that's so hard to research about power. And the reason it is because both are true. So it's absolutely the case that power corrupts. I detail lots of evidence that it changes not just your psychology, but also your brain chemistry. There's a physical change that happens when you're in power. There's all sorts of things that happen to you. And so power does corrupt. We've basically established that. But also corruptible people are more likely to seek power, especially when systems are really rotten and prone to abuse. But, and this is the important bit, you have to figure out which one is actually operating in a given instance. So if a corrupt person has gotten into power and is just abusing that power, then you don't need to change the system because they already were corrupt to begin with. You just have to get better people into power. If a good person goes into a system and gets spit out as an evil monster, you have to fix the system because then it's a good person drawn into the system and power corrupted them. So the problem is, in any individual case, you'll see somebody in power behaving badly, and there's 2 basically opposite explanations for why that happened. They were always bad or they became bad. And if you misdiagnose it, the solution is completely wrong. So it's why you have to really be sure about what's actually happening to these people.
Sure, yeah, that could be really tricky because then you end up reforming this system or something like that doesn't actually need reforming, and it's not going to help in this particular case anyways. Or if you've got a bad system, well, actually, let's just talk about India and Denmark, because this is kind of the classic example from the book.
Yeah, this is my favorite, probably my favorite study in its elegant simplicity that I cite in the book. These researchers took economics, they're economics researchers, and they went to universities both in India and Denmark, and they gave these students a really simple test, basically. They said, roll a dice 42 times, report your scores. Every time you roll a 6, we're going to pay you some money, okay? But no one's watching them report the scores. No one's watching them roll the dice. So they can report whatever they want. If they want to lie, they can. Using statistical methods of how likely it is that a 6 is going to be rolled in any given roll, you can figure out whether they're lying or not. And one guy in India even rolled 42 6s, he reported. I mean, it's serious balls on that guy. But he figured he'd try to game the system. Anyway, the point is, so when they did surveys on these people who had rolled the dice and some of them had lied about it, in India, the people who lied about their dice roll scores really wanted to go into the civil service, which is notoriously corrupt and a place where you can extract bribes and sort of get rich on the side. In Denmark, where the civil service is really clean and efficient and doesn't involve lots of graft and bribe taking, the results were completely inverted. All the honest people who rolled the dice and diligently reported their scores accurately, those are the people who wanted to go into government. So the bottom line, the punchline is rotten systems attract rotten people and good systems attract good people. So, it's not just that power draws in bad people. It does at a disproportionate rate. But it's also that if you fix the system, you get a virtuous cycle because you start to get people who want to be part of a good system that end up putting their hat in the ring, so to speak.
It almost parallels fame in a lot of ways. Maybe that's your next book. You can just reuse a bunch of stuff from this book, because I will tell you, the more that I see people in, let's say, a media industry, you see these people who start off wanting to talk about their ideals and things like that, and then a few years in, they're not getting enough traction, or they see being a crazy person gets you more traction, and suddenly they've become like extreme right or extreme left in their viewpoint, and you go, but you were on, not only did you move further to the left or to the right, you were on the other side of the aisle 2 years ago. Writing, like if you're writing an article about voting rights, and then now you're on the extreme right talking about QAnon stuff, it's like, well, wait a minute. And if you put a couple whiskeys in these people, you often find that they did care, but it didn't really work. And now, screw you, Jordan, I'm making $1 million a year, and I'm on Fox or I'm on MSNBC on my talking points all day, and it doesn't matter. And you see, you're like, what happened to you? You were like the person who wanted to be a civil service lawyer, or like a pro bono lawyer for poor people, and now you're just a straight up grifter. And it's not just money; it's also like fame and attention and friggin' likes. That does it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's incremental things that happen to people where they start to make moral compromises little by little, and they add up to serious moral compromises. And I think the other thing about this that's worth understanding is that when you design a system in which the rewards are themselves power or money, you're going to get people who are drawn to those things, right? I mean, one of the worries that I have in the U.S. context, right? So there was a great case study of this where there's now a discussion about banning members of Congress from like trading stocks individually, like the idea that they might.
I was thinking that too.
Yeah, and the thing that's amazing about this is one of the criticisms of this proposal was people said this will make running for office less attractive, and I was like, great. Like if the people who don't want to use Congress as a springboard to like get insider information to get rich off their stock trading don't run for office, that would be good. So I think you have to design a system in which like you're trying to find people for whom power is itself a burden rather than a reward. And like, there's this Douglas Adams quote, one of my favorite novelists. He says basically, anyone who can get themselves made president should on no account be allowed to do the job. And I think the idea is that people who don't want power are probably going to be best at wielding it.
That's interesting. So is then the inverse, or am I getting this wrong? Is the opposite of that also true, that people who are good at getting power are not good at wielding it, or not as good?
Yeah, so this is where you get into things like what's called the dark triad. So the dark triad is a psychological cocktail of three traits: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, being a psychopath. And these three things are disproportionately represented in the halls of power. So depending on which study you look at, psychopaths are between 4 times and 100 times more represented in powerful positions than in the general public. So that's really bad news, right? And it's because they're very, very good at wiggling their way into positions of power. They're superficial charm. They're chameleon-like. Narcissists are very aware of what other people think of them. So they're good at sort of making people like them. And these aspects of the dark triad, even though they help you get power, almost ensure that you're going to be terrible at wielding it. And so that's the sort of paradox. And it's why, one of the things that I often think about with this is like, how do we sort out who becomes powerful in much of the world? Well, mostly it's performances, right? I mean, a job interview, it's like a 45-minute performance. Like if you have media, it's performance. Elections, performance, right?
My job is also performance, so continue.
This is true.
I don't like where this is going, but go ahead and go there. Yeah,
I'm not implying you're a psychopath, Jordan, but I would say though that if you have performative aspects for how you get into power, I mean, it is obvious that people who are very good at superficial charm, are very attuned to what other people think of them, etc. They're going to be better at getting these positions. The fascinating thing about psychopaths is one of the most interesting insights that I found in talking to researchers in this book is so psychopaths have empathy switched off by default. So they basically don't feel things. So you put them in an MRI machine, you show them images of like children being hurt, animals being hurt. Their brain is basically dead. It doesn't do anything. Right? Normal people, it like lights up like a firework. It's this horrific experience. But if you tell the psychopath, if you say to them, try to imagine what it would be like to care about the kids or the animals, then their brains become normal. They actually look like everybody else's. And so the insight is that they're able to switch on empathy at times when it's strategically advantageous for them. If they're in an interpersonal relationship, or they're having to manipulate a job interview panel, whatever it is, they can turn on that sort of human feeling. And so, the fact that they can switch it on and switch it off is like really dangerous, because then when they're in power, they can very easily abuse people and not think twice about it. It's, being a psychopath doesn't come with regrets, basically. So it's a dangerous combination of being good at getting power, bad at wielding it.
Tell me about Rauchi the maintenance psycho. That guy was quite the character.
Yeah, this is one of my. It's the only one of the only things that I really lamented in writing the book was the pandemic. I was writing the book during the early stages of the pandemic, and I was going to get my brain scanned by one of these psychopath researchers, and I was also going to go and meet Steve Rauchi, the psychopathic janitor in prison. Now, Steve Rauchi is a hell of a character. So he's a janitor at the high school in Schenectady, New York. And he's got his sights set on a high target for him, not perhaps a high target for the rest of us, but he wants to be a senior maintenance official in the school district. And he's going to be ruthless to get there. So this is the best bit, I think, is that his superior is tasked with being like the energy czar, to cut costs by reducing energy costs. So they install this software that is supposed to monitor real-time energy usage across the district. But the guy doesn't understand how to use the software, the guy who's currently in this position. So Steve Rauchi says, don't worry, I'll take care of it for you. You don't have to learn the software, I'll just manage it. Now, as Steve Rauchi takes over the software, he turns the lights on the weekends. He switched the football stadium lights on Columbus Day to increase energy usage. So inevitably, when the district looks at the energy usage, they're like, it went up. You're clearly not fit for this role. So his rival gets supplanted, and Rauchi takes his job, works his way up, ends up as the union president, senior maintenance official. Actually starts making, I think, 6 figures, which for a guy who started as a janitor is obviously a major leg up. But as people start to whistleblow his abusive behavior, because he's intimidating rivals, he's being extremely manipulative and abusive. One person writes a letter explaining what's going on, and he figures out who it is and spray paints rat on their house and makes his employees make a pilgrimage to view the fact of this is what happens when you cross me. So eventually Rauchi
he took them in buses, right? During work hours to go be look at this house that got spray painted from somebody who wrote that. That's interesting. Wouldn't want to be them. So creepy and overt.
Yeah, and then on top of this, he's what researchers will call a dysfunctional psychopath, because he couldn't control his impulses. Most of the dysfunctional psychopaths end up in prison. Most of the functional psychopaths end up in business and politics. So the point is that he basically then has some guy cross him, and he plants an explosive on the guy's windshield wiper, as a threat, right? He doesn't actually light it, but it's tucked under the windshield wiper. So the police eventually get him. He's sentenced to 25 years in jail. He's got explosives in the school, in his office, when they actually raid it. Night vision goggles, right? I mean, it's not a normal thing for a maintenance officer at a school to have. So I don't know what he was plotting beyond that, but
oh my God.
It's quite the backdrop for a psychopathic figure. And as I say, he was dysfunctional. If he had maybe 10% more impulse control, perhaps this would have gone really differently, and he would have been able to stay in power and sort of continue his ascent. But he couldn't dial it off when he needed to.
Wow, it is really wild that there are people like that, and they're hard to remove. I mean, a lot of people knew he was like that, but well, it was also the union guy, and that you need to go through the union in order to get rid of this person who's got this job. So yeah, I mean, he really figured out almost how to bulletproof himself, and then he shot himself in the foot over and over until he got arrested and thrown in prison. But in the meantime, I would imagine somebody like that forces really good teachers to retire, really good whatever other people working in the school district and administration to just be screw this and move to other places or retire. And that goes maybe to what you were saying before, which is, you look at a kleptocratic regime let's again use Russia. Even if you thought, hey, we probably shouldn't be doing this, you end up dead. I mean, there's an example of, let me find the name of this guy, unless you know it. The guy who got shot right in view of the Kremlin. Do you know who this guy is?
Boris Nemtsov.
Nemtsov, yeah. So there was like Nemtsov, I think Boris Nemtsov in Russia was saying, hey, we should not be aggressive against Ukraine. And I think this is like 2014. He ends up getting shot in front of the Kremlin, essentially, and then Ukraine is invaded the first time. And this is probably not a guy who was like a choir boy, right? He was a politician in the Russian Duma. You know, this is already a corrupt system sort of from top to bottom. But he wanted to put even just a boundary that said, let's not kill a bunch of innocent civilians and start World War III potentially, and that was too much. So those people get weeded out, whether it's a school district or an Indian, I don't know, civil service type of office. You can't be good in a corrupt system because they don't want you there. It spits you out.
Yeah, I mean, this is I sort of ask the reader to imagine, you know, being thrust into the position of being the dictator of Turkmenistan. And it's like, you know, oh, yes, of course I'd be a reformer. Oh, yes, I'd be, you know, the benevolent despot, whatever it is. But like, you know, if you upset the army, they murder your family. If you don't pay your oligarchs, you get ousted from power, and then you end up potentially, you know, in front of a judge somewhere. I mean, there's serious risks to power in much of the world. And I think the situational aspect is really important. I mean, one of the areas in the book that I explored this, that was probably the weirdest thing that I did. One of the weirder things I did a lot of weird stuff when I was researching the book. But one of the weird things I did was I took a ski lesson with Paul Bremer, who was the guy who ran Iraq in 2003. So Bush appoints him to sort of like be the viceroy of Iraq. Now he is a ski instructor in Vermont. So, you know, I get in touch. I'm like, can I interview you? He's like, sure, but you got to take a ski lesson. So, you know, I pay for the full day ski lesson. Half the interview's on the chairlift, half it's back at his house. Anyway, the point is, you know, he
charged you for the ski lesson? Sorry, I just can't get past that. Why would he charge you for the ski lesson?
Well, it's because he was working that day. I mean, I can't really blame him. It was hilarious.
Okay, but like, let's do it on a day where you're not working. This is so
I know,
weird.
but it's like I was in Boston, so I only had like one day, and he's like, it's like my work day, and I was like, well, like if I hire you, is that fine? He's like, yeah, like I mean, the bosses won't care, and I love this idea of like Paul Bremer answering to like the ski bosses.
Yeah, who's like 24. Who's like, Paul. Yeah, your 15-minute break is over. Get back to work.
Exactly. I mean, it was a weird situation, and it was also odd because like he would interact with people and like you know, introduce himself and be like, "Hi, I'm Paul," and they'd be like, "Oh, nice to meet you." It's like, I wonder if you understood that this guy like literally lived in like Saddam Hussein's kid's palace. You know,
he was peeing in a golden toilet before he was riding the chairlift with you, young man.
Yeah. So anyway, but the reason I link him to this idea of situations is because like he served as ambassador to like Norway with distinction. Like he didn't do anything wrong. It was great. Everybody thought he did a great job. He gets to Iraq. He inherits this dictatorship. And like one of his first meetings, if not the first meeting, he floats this idea of shooting looters to send the message that like order is being restored. And, you know, I challenge him on this. I'm like, you know, you couldn't do this in the US. And he's like, yeah, but this wasn't the US. Like I literally took over a dictatorship. Like everything I had to consider was like awful. Everything. Right? It was like, do we divert electricity from this area or that area? People will die no matter what I do. So, you know, I took that point that you have people who can be good or bad people, and in different situations will behave in good or bad ways. And I think that lesson is one that I've really taken to heart the more that I've interviewed people who have been in powerful positions, that like it's really, really complicated and it's not actually that productive to just straight up condemn people as awful people. It's better to understand why they ended up doing what they did, because then you can stop it. You know, moral condemnation has its place. And like, I think Paul Bremer screwed a lot of things up. But I think what's important from talking to him is understanding how someone who is, you know, seemingly a person who believed in democracy and rule of law could then contemplate shooting people who were stealing TVs. And that's a much more instructive lesson that you can get from someone like Paul Bremer than just saying, you know, Paul Bremer bad, end of story.
When I think, what would I do if I were thrust in power in Turkmenistan, the first thing I would do is resign. I would never want to be in a position like that. And it sort of proves your point, right? That like somebody who is, well, I can handle this. And meanwhile, you know, it's a lot of stress, but I'm going to have a huge yacht and I'm going to do all kinds of crazy stuff and I'm going to stash money away and buy have a Swiss bank account or whatever it is. They're thinking of that, and I'm thinking I do not want any part of this at all, because even if I do that, I'm looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. You're holding a wolf by the ears. You can never let it go. You're going to end up dead probably before you want to be, and people who are around you are either going to be stabbing you in the back or getting stabbed by somebody else to get to you. It's like the worst fate you could really have in terms of being in any position. Like, I would literally rather do just about anything than be the dictator of a totalitarian or authoritarian regime. It sounds horrible. And you're not going to pivot to friggin' Singapore. Like, it's not possible. The system is too rotten. It's set up that way, and you can't change it as much power as you have.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I looked into this, and this links back to the psychopaths as well, because when I crunched the numbers in African countries, for like 50 years between 1960 and 2010, it was basically a coin flip. It was 43% of the leaders who lost power ended up dead in jail or in exile, right? So you've got a 50-50 chance almost of having something horrific happen to you. Now, psychopaths are notorious for discounting risk because they believe they're smarter than everybody else. So they think, oh, like the chump ended up executed by like an angry mob, but like I wouldn't do that. I'm a psychopath. I'm smarter than them. And so I think that when you have particularly dangerous roles, you're going to have an extra overrepresentation of psychopaths beyond what you already would, because they're the people who are thinking, I'll roll the dice. I'm going to outsmart these people. They're all chumps.
I could see that. I mean, I can see a narcissistic psychopath just decide that it's never going to happen to me. I mean, that's kind of their MO, right? And if it does happen to me, screw it. I'm just going to do all these other bad things and get away, or bribe them or something. I mean, how does the way that we hire, especially for, let's say, higher stress power positions, do we end up selecting for psychopaths? You kind of hinted that was the case. Obviously, not everyone in power is a psychopath. They almost seem better suited to those jobs, though, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a few things. One is recruitment matters enormously, right? So one of the major arguments I make in the book is that there's a self-selection effect with power. So you basically sort of say, who wants to be powerful? Well, power-hungry people, by definition, are going to be more likely to put their hat in the ring. I mean, it's sort of like at a basketball game or a basketball tryout for a high school. Like, you'd find it quite weird if a bunch of sort of average height people showed up for the tryout. You're expecting the tall people to show. The same is true for power. The power hungry people put their hat in the ring. Now you can like dial that up or dial that down depending on how you set up the system. So I talk about policing in this regard, and I think it's one of the most instructive areas of my research that I found was. So there's a tale of two police departments that I talk about, the U.S. and New Zealand. And in America, there's this police department in Doraville, Georgia, a small town outside Atlanta, 10,000 people. And the video they had on their department website was like, it was a caricature. I mean, it starts with the Punisher logo. So you've got like an anti-hero vigilante who tortures criminals, basically, as like, this is what we're studying policing as, like, that's what it is, right? And then like, after the Punisher logo ends, you see this literal tank on screen and a bunch of police officers dressed as soldiers like open the hatch of the tank, throw out some smoke grenades, shoot their guns, get back in the tank, and the tank like rolls off, and they're playing this death metal music in the background. And I'm like who applies for that job, right? Like there's a certain type of person that thinks that's what policing should be. Yeah. I should be that police officer. And New Zealand basically had a national epiphany where they're like, we have a problem with self-selection in the police where people who want to walk around with a gun and a badge for the sake of it are more likely to apply. Now, it's not because all cops are like this. It's just disproportionately you're going to get more applicants who sort of think, oh, it'd be great if I had a gun and a badge and could walk around. So what the New Zealand police did is they set up a recruitment video, a very funny video. If you Google, New Zealand police ad, you'll find this. And it makes policing look fun and community oriented. There's a whole bunch of gags during it. It's a very amusing video. And ultimately they're like all chasing this like unseen perpetrator that you like don't know who they're chasing. And at the end it turns out to be a border collie who has stolen like some woman's purse, and they're like, freeze, And it's like the juxtaposition between that and the Punisher logo is really the icing on the cake. The video in New Zealand ends with the slogan, "Do you care enough to be a cop?" And it's like, I mean, can you imagine a more stark change between Punisher and Do You Care Enough to Be a Cop? And so lo and behold, what happened? New Zealand got way more applicants, way more diverse applicants. different demographic and different personality profiles. Abuse fell, relationship with the community improved. I mean, it wasn't rocket science. They put some money into a nice video that made policing look like service, and more service-oriented people turned up. So I don't think it's like a really difficult thing to do, but I think it's a lot of organizations don't even think carefully about how they recruit people into positions of power.
Man, this is like a vicious cycle because now, especially in American policing, we see all these problems that we have, and there's people saying like, "Oh, cops are bad" or whatever, and that's horrible because if you thought, look, I know cops have this rep, but I'm going to be a community service officer and I speak multiple languages. I'm going to be the liaison between the Vietnamese community and the police department. Now you're like, well, I'm not signing up to be a bad guy. But the person who's like, I don't care if they think all cops are bad. I'm going to beat their ass if they say that to my face. Those people are the ones who are now applying. So this media attention for these problems that we already have is actually growing the exact same problem by decreasing applicant quality, right?
Yeah, well, you're exactly right about that. But on top of that, if you have existing racial biases in terms of like who is in the police, so like in Ferguson, Missouri, right, this flashpoint, overwhelmingly black population, overwhelmingly white police force. You try to recruit into it. What do the cops look like? They're overwhelmingly white. So black people are less likely to apply because the mystique of police in Ferguson, the sort of perception of them was that it's white people who are abusing black people. Therefore, black people weren't applying to the roles. So you're right. It's a vicious circle. And that's why you have to think so carefully about trying to break that cycle with proactive recruitment. So you can't just go on autopilot. And I think a lot of positions of power are sort of like, let's just put out like a call for applicants and see who comes back. And they're ignoring the self-selection effect, which is so pervasive everywhere that you have power. Politics, business, police, whatever. Certain types of people for whom power is the goal, power is the reward, those people are most likely to apply. So you have to counteract that some way with some clever recruitment efforts and strategies.
Right, yeah, it's not just who gets the job, it's who applies to the job in the first place. Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. I wonder, what do you think about, there was a police department near me. Do you know what an MRAP is? It's like a mine-resistant vehicle. They wanted to get an MRAP, and a petition went around, and it was like, we're not getting this. And I think the counter-argument was like, it's almost free, or it's like basically free, or it is free, it just costs gasoline. And the argument from the person with the petition that I signed was, this is Campbell, California. We don't need a mine-resistant vehicle. This is like a calm, small suburb. There are no mines anywhere in the state of California. Why do you need this? It's just going to encourage bad behavior. It might look cool in a parade, but also like maintenance costs were through the roof because it guzzles gas and like needs special parts. It was the dumbest freaking thing in the world. But I wondered why a department would even have access to something like this. And it turns out that there's a ton of military surplus vehicles going to police departments that are causing increased militarization of the police. And I'm not saying police shouldn't have riot shields and things like that. We don't need tanks. We have the National Guard if we run into a really big problem with well-armed criminals or terrorists. Police that have never fired their gun ever don't need a tank.
Yeah, well, and I think you're right to point to this idea of the further militarization, because there have been studies that look at who takes these. Basically, the military gear is coming from decommissioned, tanks, vehicles, etc., from Iraq and Afghanistan that are effectively going to be junked. So instead, they just give them to police departments at very, very low cost. And the problem is the research shows that the departments that take these vehicles, first off, tend to have more violence in the beginning, and they tend to get more violent after they've gotten the vehicle. So, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that, like, it's the sort of aphorism of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you've got an MRAP, everybody looks like a potential, terrorist or whatever it is. The funniest thing, though, I love this when I was looking up these statistics, all these spreadsheets that are quite boring, but one of them that stood out is, I think it's called Boone County, Indiana. It might be township. It has one farmhouse that is on a pond, and that is the entirety of water in the entire jurisdiction, and it has an amphibious assault boat. They're like, if that farm gets attacked, they are so set, right? But anywhere else, it's totally useless.
That's so ridiculous. I mean, look, as a 12-year-old boy in the body of a 42-year-old man, that stuff is really cool. I totally get the appeal to taking it. I think it would be fun for them to sort of LARP that they might eventually need this. And who knows, one day it might come in handy, costs aside. But it's not good for you to think, man, one day I'm totally going to use this, right? That's a bad idea. The community where I grew up, they had what I assume was a seized vehicle. I don't know. And it was a Lamborghini, like a really nice Lamborghini painted with police colors and said police on the side, and it had the lights on the top. And it was like a high-speed pursuit vehicle. And they eventually got rid of it because turns out we don't want high-speed pursuits going down Woodward Avenue in Detroit and the suburbs of Detroit. If somebody is driving really fast, there are other ways to deal with them than sending a Lamborghini after them at 105 miles an hour. That's a bad idea. So, but the cop that drove that, look, I've never met the guy, but I assume he longed for the day he saw a sports car going 85, 95 miles an hour down Woodward so he could take pursuit. Because why wouldn't you? Why the hell would you want to drive a Lamborghini 25, 35 miles an hour? Like, that's not what it's for. So these sorts of military hardware, it seems like they just encourage that behavior. Because I know it would work on, that's how I would feel. I'd be like, I want to shoot this thing. When are they going to let me shoot the gun?
Yeah, well, I also think, I mean, it's one of these things, too, where, like, you know, if you're recruiting for a SWAT team, like, by all means, you need combat vehicles, you need combat personnel, right?
Of course.
But, like, a lot of policing in the United States has that sort of mentality for small town problems. And if you've got, you know, as you say, the MRAP in the sort of quiet suburb, then yeah, I mean, it is. And I'm the same way, right? I mean, I think it'd be fun to drive.
Yeah.
But I also think that, you know, what the person who I talked to in New Zealand said to me is they're like we're not going to have a shortage of people with like combat experience or sort of this sort of militarized mentality. They're going to apply no matter how we recruit. Like if we recruit this way or that way, they're going to come. But what we're going to lose out if we recruit in the wrong way, if we sort of make policing look like an occupying army, is all the people who actually would make really good beat cops, but don't see themselves as the person who drives around in a tank. So, you know, it's about sort of the balance of understanding, like, what are you going to lose out? You're not going to lose out on the people who actually would make good SWAT leaders, because they're actually going to apply no matter what you do. But you do want to portray the people who look at this and say, nah, it's not my thing. It doesn't look like me. And this is true. You know, this lesson is not just for policing; it's for business, it's for politics. Like, if politics looks like a corrupt cesspool where you get death threats and people harass you, and you have to lie all the time, and you see that people are fundraising constantly, the people who are willing to accept that are going to run for office. And the reason they're going to do that is because the payoff is power. So you've basically engineered a system where there's so many downsides to running for office. There's one really big upside, and that's power. Who runs? The people who care exclusively about power. I mean, it's like, you know, so it's just about engineering systems that make it more attractive to ordinary, decent people to actually throw their hat in the ring for these posts.
Did you research Singapore at all when you were doing this? Because that seems to be like the good example of like they pay their civil servants ridiculous amounts of money. I say ridiculous, but it's effective. So that the best student in your class is like, I'm going to go work for the government because that's where it's at. Whereas like the worst student in your class in Serbia is the guy who wants to be the police chief.
Yeah, so Singapore turned itself around in a very short period of time. I mean, it was like a very corrupt backwater in the 1950s. And you're right to point to it. This thought occurred to me. That's why I had a plane ticket booked for April of 2020 to fly to Singapore, which didn't happen. So
good timing.
It didn't end up going in the book. But I was planning to. There was a guy I was going to interview who was at the Airports Commission, and you know, this like government official, and it's like, there is like zero corruption in this organization, right? Because it's like absolutely stamped out. And so, you know, it was sort of I was going to ask him the recipe for how he did this and so on. But I think it's this aspect where in Singapore you have an anti-corruption president come to power and sort of lead the country into a much more clean style of governance. But my point is like, that was sort of lucky. Right? Like you had a bad system and you had a reformer come in and turn things around. That's great. Like it's wonderful. But like, do you want to bank your future on luck? So some places are occasionally going to get those reformers. My argument is rather than waiting for like the perfect leader to emerge who's actually going to turn things around. Try to engineer the system so that better leaders come in the first place. It's a much safer bet. So, and the reason we talk about Singapore is precisely because it's such an outlier, right? It's so unusual that this corrupt spot just became uncorrupt very, very quickly.
I think if we had a close look, there's got to be a book on this, but I would imagine if we take a really close look, there's some dirty laundry in how that probably happened, right?
I'm sure a lot of eggs were broken. It's like the sort of, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. I'm pretty sure they broke a lot of eggs in the process.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of police, though, this Alaska anecdote, I don't want to belabor the point, but this was extra special. Tell us about the Alaska problem.
Yeah, so I'm trying to make the argument that one of the big issues with abuse of power is that if your recruitment is too shallow, in other words, if you've got 5 jobs and only 5 people apply, you can't exactly call the bad apples. So in Stebbins, Alaska, they had this problem on steroids. What happened was basically this small little township needs police officers, and they're constantly recruiting and no one's applying. So what's happened now is that until recently, 100% of their police officers are felons who have committed domestic abuse.
100%.
Yeah, and like serious crimes. I mean, the police chief had I think abused minors. I mean, there's 17 convictions for the police chief, I believe. If off the top of my head, it's 17 arrests anyway.
Oh my God.
And the problem was, so I tell this story of this woman who's being beat up by this abusive man, and she calls the cops. Who comes? I mean, a domestic abuser.
Sure.
Right? So it's
every time.
And so the point is not, it's not rocket science, but it's if you don't recruit for numbers, you're going to have real problems with abuse, because the odds that one of those people is a rotten apple is so much higher than if you get 100 applicants and you pick 5 out of them. And yet, Stebbins probably could have done more to incentivize becoming a police officer, to try to proactively talk to people who might make good cops. They just sort of said, anyone who wants to apply, here's the uniform. And that's literally what happened. There's a guy named Nimron Mike who talked to a reporter about this, and he's like, yeah, I was sort of surprised because I was just in prison, and then I went and they said, here's the uniform. Congratulations. So it's quite an extreme example, but it illustrates that point of how much depth of recruiting is essential to reducing abuses of power.
In the book, you discuss some of these old humiliation rituals for hunting and hunter-gatherer societies. And you note that humans spent 95% plus of our history in a flat hierarchy. So having this sort of despotism / the type of hierarchy that we have now, this is the abnormality, not the flat structure that we had prior. So why do we need a hierarchy then? Obviously, in larger numbers of people, this starts to become important, right?
Yeah, so the significant chunk of human history, the conventional wisdom is that most of human history, we lived in bands of up to about 80 people of hunter-gatherers, and that there was this sort of ruthless attempt to cut people down to size whenever they tried to become the leader of the band, because they didn't want to have hierarchy. And that was possible because everybody knew everybody else. So you could work in collaborative settings and so on. The 2 main hypotheses about why this changed are what I call pithily the war and peace hypothesis, PEAS. It's either warfare or agriculture. So warfare is eventually the bands realized they could conquer and steal each other's stuff. So you eventually figure out that if you have 150 guys attacking 80, it's actually really helpful. So you start to conquer societies, the numbers grow, etc. That's the war hypothesis for hierarchy, larger groups of humans via conquest. The peace hypothesis is agriculture, and it's tied to this idea of the agricultural revolution. And all of a sudden, you could get your food while staying in the same place. So the size of the group wasn't the constraining factor. You didn't have to worry about everybody moving across the savannah while you're hunting. Instead, you just sort of make a city. So in a sort of blink of human history, you go from very little hierarchy to extremely hierarchical mega empires in the form of the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, etc. So the short answer is that anytime you get into large groups, you probably need hierarchy. One of the guys I interviewed, Peter Turchin, he said to me, we're not ants. Ants regulate via pheromones and so on. So they can have a large number of ants, and they have these scents and pheromones that can tell them what to do. And, they don't need to have, they obviously have the queen and so on, but it's not a situation where you necessarily need that in humans because we don't regulate that same way. So we need bosses. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is like, that's not the problem, right? A lot of people are like, oh, hierarchy is the problem. It's like, no, you can make systems that are super hierarchical, but are also just and like also fair and also attract better people. It's just that the current way that we've created hierarchy has been, I think, highly destructive, and we need to re-engineer power to make it work much better.
So we're not hardwired to select the wrong type of leader. You know, we're hardwired to eat sugar, fat, salt as much as we can because we have Stone Age brains. Are we attracted to some element? Is our Stone Age brain attracted to some element of a leader? Like, are we attracted to the top warrior dog, so to speak? Is that a thing?
Yeah. So the best evidence we have is that we live in these sort of egalitarian bands for a lot of human history, but when there's a crisis, like when a rival band attacks you, it still makes sense to turn to like the big warrior, right? Like the physically strong man who can protect the group. So the argument that evolutionary psychologists make, this sort of Stone Age mismatch hypothesis, is basically saying, look, it's 50,000 years since this hunter-gatherer societies to now. That's not enough time for evolution to have actually changed our brains. So we've got the same brain. We're functionally working with the same exact brain as like the hunter-gatherers. But back then, when that brain evolved, it made a lot of sense to turn to the physically large male in a time of crisis. And because we have the same brain, it makes sense that we still have that template within us when we select leaders. And lo and behold, when they do psychology research about leadership selection, there's not a very strong effect for strong males, except for when you prime people with the idea of there's a war on or a famine or some sort of crisis, and then the effect of strong males, tall males as well, is much more pronounced. And what's interesting about this is like this sort of explains why Vladimir Putin poses shirtless. He's not tall. He's
just
short.
Gonna say Vladimir Putin shirtless on a horse. Like that's
yeah. I mean, it's well, and also the war in Ukraine, right? Like you've manufactured a crisis. Now the strongman persona becomes much more important, and he was less popular before the war. So, you know, if his popularity's slipping, and he's now got a crisis and he's trying to create this strongman persona. I mean, I can understand the logic that he may have been going for. One of the details that I love in researching this is like, there's these articles that show that height is correlated with like electoral victory, but they show that the effect is most pronounced on men. And this politician in Australia like read this research apparently and got her legs broken and stretched by 3 inches.
Oh my God.
She hadn't read like the footnote, which was like, this only applies to men. So like she won her election, but the evidence suggests that she didn't win it because she got her legs broken and stretched.
Oh God, that sounds extremely painful. How bad, speaking of the sign, the wrong people in power, how bad do you want power where you're like, you know what? I'm just not going to walk for 8 months or however long that takes. There's no way that's a fast process. There's just no way.
And it wasn't even like she's not the prime minister. It was like, I think it was a local position in the regional government she was running for. It's like, there's something wrong with this person. But anyway, it's
how bad did you want to be the treasurer of New South Wales? Like, what are you doing? For God's sake. So what molds behavior? Is it culture or is it consequences? You have the sort of UN parking ticket story that discusses these principles.
Yeah, I love this part of the book. So this is, it's both, right? It's culture and consequences. But the UN parking ticket study is like one of these most elegant studies in the most banal of locations. So like what they do is they look at what diplomats to the United Nations are getting in terms of parking fines. So they all have diplomatic immunity. They're not prosecutable because they are diplomats. And that extends to parking violations. So they get these fines for illegally parking in Manhattan, and the city can't collect. So they rack up, I'm not joking, 150,000 parking tickets to the tune of $18 million. And the city is like, we want this money, right? Like this is like, this isn't cool. And also you're really blocking up our streets. So we have to do something about it. So Mike Bloomberg decides to crack down on this and says, we're going to impound your cars. We might not be able to force you to pay, but we're going to take your car away. So you have this like accidental experiment because before Bloomberg cracks down, it's the Wild West. Everybody can do what they want and they can park illegally and get away with it. After the crackdown, there's consequences across the board. And what do you find? Lo and behold, in the pre-enforcement period, there's very little illegal parking from the countries that have low levels of corruption. So the Norwegians, the Germans, the Japanese all park like angels, right? Mm-hmm. In the less clean countries, the less, the more corrupt countries, we're talking Yemen and Egypt and so on, we're talking like 190 parking tickets per diplomat. I mean, they really
That's
really
like
went to
every
town.
day, multiple times a day, just leaving the car in the road. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean,
because
it's
that's,
like you
that's
might
how
as
many
well.
times you get caught, by the way, right? Like,
Yeah,
that's how
exactly.
many, not how many times you did it. That's how many times you got caught doing it. And I've probably parked poorly a bunch of times, and I have like 2 tickets in my life, right? So if you're getting 190 tickets yourself, you every day, all day, are just not doing whatever the hell you want, and you're maybe even just trying to make it illegal because you can.
Well, and it's the average too, right? So like
Right.
there must be some people who are parking like normally or didn't have a car. So it's like
Yeah, I was going to say some of
probably had,
these guys don't even drive. Yeah.
But the kicker on this story is that the Yemenis and the Egyptians and the countries where the cultures of corruption were prominent, who were parking illegally, all of a sudden, as soon as the consequences come in, they start parking like the Norwegians and the Germans and the Japanese, like overnight, right? Like 0 parking tickets per diplomat, basically. And the other really interesting wrinkle is that if you look at like longevity, the time that a diplomat spent in New York in the pre-enforcement period, in the sort of Wild West period where you could get away with it, the Norwegians and Germans and Japanese that were there longer started parking illegally more. So it's a combination of culture and consequence. Like you start with this idea that you shouldn't break the rules because you're from this sort of, uncorrupt country. But then the more that you start to think like, I'm sort of a chump for not taking advantage of this. Like I really want to park next to the restaurant, even though I shouldn't, you start to sort of make, as I was talking about before, these little ratcheting effects of like moral compromises. And this is where even in the quote unquote clean countries, you have bad behavior accumulate the longer you're able to get away with something. So accountability really, really matters.
Why do corrupt, especially dictators, what's up with the cult of personality? Why do they make up Kim Jong Un doesn't have a butthole, or Kim Jong Il got 18 holes in one the first time he played golf? Like, why? What is that all about? I always wondered about that, because it's not just unique to North Korea having weird, quirky nonsense. Turkmenistan has it. Every sort of country that I've been to that had a dictator, like Slobodan Milosevic, had stuff like this. It's just a thing they do. I don't understand what's going on there.
Yeah, Turkmenistan's a great example too. I write mostly about North Korea in the book, but in Turkmenistan they have this golden statue that rotates to always face the sun. They have these like golden statues of like the dictator's dog, and a whole series of other things. There's lots of also music videos involving the dictator, which are quite exceptional. But the reason for these lies that are invented by these regimes about the sort of cult of personality, the sort of, as you say, Kim Jong Il composed of 10,000 operas, is because they're loyalty tests. And this is what people get often very wrong about dictators. They're actually acting extremely rationally a lot of the time, even though they seem like insane megalomaniacs. And what I mean by that is like, okay, so let's say that you tell people that the dictator can fly, okay? Everybody knows it's not true. But if all the people around the dictator are like, oh yes, of course the dictator can fly, it's a proxy for being able to figure out who is loyal to you and who is trustworthy. You don't need to execute them because they're willing to lie for you. They're willing to obviously say something that is untrue, even though it will embarrass them. The problem is that eventually, like, let's say you're in North Korea and it becomes the accepted wisdom that the dictator can fly. Okay, there's a problem because now everybody is saying it, so it's not a loyalty test anymore. So now you need to be able to say, like, the dictator can fly to the moon. And all of a sudden the people who can say that, they're like, okay, they're the loyal ones, right? So it's a ratcheting effect. It gets more extreme over time. So these cults of personality start out with small lies, like, oh, it's the father of the nation. Like, in North Korea, there's this Mount Paektu, and the sort of bloodline is descended from it. I mean, it gets more and more extreme over time. And I think that's because the more accepted the lie is, the more that it doesn't function as a loyalty test. This came up, by the way, with the invasion of Ukraine, because like one of the pretexts that Vladimir Putin said is he's like, we're getting rid of like the neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine. It's like the president is Jewish. And so, like everybody knows this is a crazy thing to say. And yet, like, if your propaganda minister goes on TV and is like, oh, yes, of course, like it's the neo-Nazi regime led by the Jewish president, he's loyal. So, I think this is happening in a lot of places with authoritarianism, where lying on behalf of the leader is a strategic choice to sort of vet people, especially in an environment where you can't actually speak your mind, right? So you don't actually know who's loyal, because everybody who's actually plotting against you is going to be very, very quiet because it's so scary to stand up to a dictator.
This reminds me of there's so many ridiculous North Korea stories that I've told on this show, but one of them is that I don't know if I've told is we were at something called the Train Museum. Have you been to North Korea?
I have not. No.
Okay.
You have, haven't you?
Yeah. Been there
That's
like
crazy.
4 times. So
Wow.
the Train Museum sounds really boring, but it is actually hilarious, and there's a lot of propaganda in there. Like there is in every museum, but there's especially interesting stuff in the Train Museum. And there's a painting of Mount Paektu, right? And it's Kim Il-sung, so the first sort of father of the nation of North Korea, holding baby Kim Jong-il, but he's shooting 2 Japanese soldiers at the same time or something like that. Like he's got, shooting one and then the other or whatever the painting was. And I said, why did they bring the baby into the battle? That doesn't seem like good parenting. And so the guide that was with us, who's North Korean, started laughing involuntarily and then immediately caught herself because it's ridiculous. The museum guide was mildly but not very amused, and then they talked about it. We paused the tour for a good 2 or 3 minutes, and then they turned around and they said, the reason is because they wanted to show General Kim Jong-il how battle was so he would have early experience. And they were dead freaking serious, even though it was so obvious they had just made this answer up out of their total wazoo. And I was like, you could have left it. But they were like, nope, we need to make this make sense, because if we don't, we could get in trouble for this, especially after laughing and spitting out, a little bit of spit bubbles because it was such a dumb question. So that seems how these things form, right? It's like everyone just knows they gotta make it work. And if it means, he rides around on a flying horse, which is what they say about Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong Un, because they have a flying horse in Korean mythology. They will just straight face say that, even if 2 minutes ago they had no answer to your question at all for how he gets from one place to another quickly. They will make it up.
Well, and it makes sense. It's survival, right? I mean, this goes back to the point about the sort of like how the context dictates behavior. Like if these people, it's not like these people are just liars or insane people. I mean,
No.
they're not submissive or docile. It's just like, if you understand that you might die if you don't make up a lie about a baby, you're going to make up a lie about a baby. I mean, it's just, I think that's the thing that's also so corrosive about power is that, when we talk about power corrupting, we're really talking about the individual. But there's a much more profound effect that's like the people around them also get corrupted because they have to make all of these little sacrifices or transgressions in order to survive in the world around that person. In business, if you've got a psychopathic mid-level manager, the team is going to be screwed, right? Because either you have to conform to that person's like leadership style or you get ousted. And I think this is the same sort of dynamic as you would have in positions of power and around dictators, where it's just like you're winging it because it's survival, and you've got to make it up if you want to make it.
You talked about your brain changing or having physical changes, which I assume is also or mostly in your brain with respect to power. Let's talk about Monkeys on Cocaine, which, by the way, sounds like a punk band from the early 2000s. How fast? So tell me about this experiment, this study.
Yeah, there's this guy named Dr. Michael Nader who's out at Wake Forest, and he has like a class 2 drug license because he has pure cut cocaine in like this. It's sort of funny because like it's apparently in this safe, and there's like 2 keys that have to be turned at the same time to like access the pure cut cocaine.
Yeah, I was gonna say, sure, it's in the safe.
Yeah.
Oh look, safe's empty. Where did it go? I have no idea.
So what they do though is they try to test like how hierarchy affects behavior and dopamine receptors in the brain. And basically the point is they take these 4 macaque monkeys and they're individually housed, which means that they don't have any interaction with any other monkeys. So it's like, they're all alone. And then they raise the barriers, and all of a sudden these 4 monkeys are together. And like in 10 minutes, they set up a hierarchy. And like the researchers can very clearly see the pecking order. They're like 1, 2, 3, 4, it's done. Then what they do is they put each of the monkeys, after they've experienced this hierarchy for a bit, in a chair. And the monkeys have been trained to use this chair. It's got 2 levers. You pull one lever, banana pellets come out. You pull the other lever, intravenous cocaine gets injected into your bloodstream. Now, what's amazing about this is that the submissive monkeys, the ones who end up in 3 and 4, always take the cocaine. The 1 and 2 always take the banana pellets. But if you take the monkeys who are like the 1 and 2 in one group and you rehouse them in a different group, and through misfortune, they end up as monkey 3 or monkey 4 in the new group, cocaine. And then when you open up their brains and you look at the sort of chemical structures within them, they've physically changed. Their dopamine receptors have shifted. And this is what I think is truly amazing, where we have to think so carefully about like stuff that's really odd, but is like empirically proven happens to people in positions of power. So we need to understand that better if we want to stop abuse, because it's not just some like mild psychological effect. There's actually, I think, a brain chemistry change that's happening. Now, we can't do this in humans because you can't slice open someone's brain after they become like a CEO and be like, oh yeah, the dopamine did change. Too bad we killed them. So there's problems with this, obviously, on an ethical point of view for doing the research on humans. But the evidence does seem to suggest with things like stress levels that there are also physical changes in humans that we can document.
Yeah, I've spoke actually with Dacher Keltner, episode 519 of this show. I'm sure you came across his research speaking about what power or a lack of power can do to make people even physically sick. So the idea that the lower monkeys in the hierarchy decided to take drugs maybe brings up some uncomfortable questions about our own society and what we think of people who are impoverished and lack power and maybe use substances in greater numbers, right? Or potentially, supposedly in greater numbers. I'd love to see more data on that. That's probably not a super popular set of questions to be asking, depending on, maybe in Berkeley or something like that, where Dacher is. But in a lot of places, we don't really want to look into that closet for those skeletons, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, so I flew out to Berkeley and I interviewed Dacher, and he's this quintessential... he looks like a guy he's a psychologist, but he's like on a pro surfer tour on the weekends. He's got like this long blonde hair and he's super chilled out. And like I walked into his house and he's like, first I have to ask you a question. Have you had a snack? It's like this. So anyway, he studies some really, really interesting stuff about power. And I think you're right to point out this idea that like, we don't do enough to understand that there are actual effects of powerlessness. And I think this is something where, when I've done the research on issues related to stress and so on, like there's evidence that people who are powerless die faster because their body is stressed more. And, the evidence for this, it's both we can see this in CEOs where people at the pinnacle of power age faster. I'll talk about that in a second. But there's a study with baboons where they can actually study the genetic aging rate of an individual. So they use this thing called DNA methylation to figure out how genetically quickly you're aging relative to the calendar. So like, it could be 6 months have elapsed, but you've actually aged 9 months, or it could be that you've aged 3 months. And what they found is like, as they expected, as you go down the hierarchy in the baboon group, you have more stress at the bottom because you don't have access to food, you don't have access to mates, it just sucks basically. Makes sense. As you go up, it gets better. Up until the very top, the alpha is extremely stressed and aging very quickly. And it's because there's a target on their back all the time. So they've got all the resources, they've got all the mates, but they're constantly looking over their shoulder. And so, I think this is the lesson here is it's good to be in the court. It may not be good to be the king. But like in human society, there's evidence for this as well, where one of the best studies that I came across looks at like presidents versus runner-ups in elections over 17 countries, 200 years, right? So like a long sweep of history. And what they found is that the runner-ups, the people who lost, lived 4.4 years longer on average than the people who won. So the sort of consolation prize of losing an election and not becoming president might be 4.5 years more life.
Wow, yeah, that's not a bad deal. Other than, again, you're talking about people who had their legs broken and stretched to gain 3 inches so they could win a local election. So I don't know. I don't know about the calculations going on over there sometimes. Not that I'm dwelling on this, but how does that guy get pure cocaine? Is that made like in a pharmaceutical lab? I'm asking for a friend. He probably has great parties, by the way.
It's a thing. I think it's related to the DEA. So I think it's seized.
Okay.
And then they purify it. So he has this license where he's given this the street value would be like off the charts because it is completely pure. Because I think in a scientific lab, as far as I understand it, they take a street cocaine that they've seized, and then they purify it up to like medical grade, and then he gets it. Yeah. So
wow.
Yeah, I guess it's a perk of being out at Wake Forest.
one section of the book that I loved, and in closing here, I know you got to go, but these ancient ordeals like trial by fire or holding a piping hot piece of metal, shoving your hand in boiling water. What's going on with these? What does this have to do with power and oversight?
Yeah, so these ancient ordeals, they're things that you might have come across, like in Monty Python, the Holy Grail. They have like the witch, the sort of witch trial, and they try to weigh the witch and figure out if she's really a witch. They have ordeals that also existed when you were accused of a crime, where you'd be given a boiling cauldron of water, and they'd say, well, if you're innocent, stick your hand in the boiling cauldron of water, and you will prove that you have nothing to hide because God will spare you, right? So God will intervene. And for a long time, people were sort of like, well, this was insane, right? Like, this is not a good way of like meting out criminal punishment and determining justice. But there's an economist named Peter Leeson who's argued that this was actually a highly rational mechanism, because what would happen is the priests who are like overseeing these ordeals would say, okay, here's your choice. We think you're a murderer. You can either stick your hand in a boiling cauldron of water, or we can just condemn you. It's up to you. Now, if you're innocent, we know that God will intervene and protect you. So what would happen, according to Leeson's research, is the person who actually was innocent would believe this, right? Because they would believe that God would intervene to protect them based on their religious teachings. So they'd say, okay, I'll stick my hand in. And at that point, the monks would provide a less boiling cauldron of water that they could then stick their hand in and be like, oh, miraculously, my skin is not burned. You must have been innocent. Because the very act of accepting the challenge, the ordeal, showed that you were willing to go through it. Whereas the guilty person was like, yeah, I don't want to do that, right? So his argument is that it's a sorting mechanism. And what's interesting, and this is where I use it for the book, is I say, in the past, because of this sort of ubiquitous belief in God, everybody, rich and powerful, poor and weak, believed that there was going to be divine punishment if they broke the rules, right? So you had potentially something that was the glue that held society together, because there was no police, there was no real accountability. But if you murdered someone, you believed you would burn in hell. So it provided this sort of social function that over time might have been really, really good for our species. What's happened now is the state has largely supplanted that, particularly as religious beliefs have declined. So rather than believing that you'll, face eternal damnation, I mean, certainly some people still think that, but a significant chunk of the population in modern times worries more about the police and jail than they do about, a cauldron and an ordeal and God's punishment. So the point that I'm trying to make is that oversight really is important, because this sort of risk of accountability for abusive behavior is what deters it. And my worry, and this is something I try to explain, but I think it's exacerbated by the pandemic, is a lot of the surveillance that exists in modern times is geared towards the people who are low down the pecking order. So in the pandemic, these new devices were created from work from home people, where some businesses have sensors on people's chairs in their office that shows if you're sitting at your desk. And Enron wasn't brought down by somebody who took a lunch break that was 5 minutes too long. It was brought down by people at the top. And all of the sort of surveillance that exists in modern society is looking downward, whereas most of the harm is produced by the people who are in the opaque corner office or in positions of high political power. So what I'm sort of arguing is taking the logic of the ordeals to its modern day equivalent. You need to have oversight, but you need to put it in the right places. You need to put it looking at the people who are most prone to abuse. And I don't think this means that we try to constantly make a surveillance society, but for certain jobs that are, extremely prone to abuse and embezzlement, high-level politicians, police officers who may be involved in violent incidents, I think a bit of oversight makes a lot of sense. And I think that's the readjustment that we have to have in modern society.
Yeah, it seems like powerful or corrupt people can work their way around. Watched people behave better, right? But who's watching the watchers? That's the question. So if I'm the guy in charge, it's well, no. Point the cameras at the open floor plan. I'll be here in the corner office embezzling or cooking the books or whatever it is. We need to be watching the Chinese Communist Party, not the jaywalkers in Beijing. We need to watch Congress, not the Amazon delivery guy. Or maybe a little bit of both.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned the open plan office, right? Because that's a perfect little example of how we conceptualize this. The open plan office is a surveillance office. It's everybody is watching everybody. Where is most of the abuse happening? Where is most of the embezzlement happening? Where is most of the stuff that can take down the company happening? In the opaque windows of the corner office, right? And I think that's indicative of a mentality shift, but you have to get these people to accept it. I mean, one of the problems, and I talk about solutions in sort of the last third of the book, and I'm trying to engineer things that can fix this, but there is a dilemma, which is how do you get people who like abusing power to accept significantly more scrutiny? And I have a few proposals for that, but I think it's one of the big challenges of cleaning these systems up is you have to fundamentally get people to accept significantly greater levels of oversight as they're currently in power, potentially abusing it.
Yeah, some of the solutions are interesting. I'm going to go over some of these in the show close so that you don't have to sort of reiterate everything that you'd said. I think really interesting studies, really interesting conversation. Thank you very much for doing the show, man. I know we went a little long, but I think it was worth it.
It was awesome. I mean, and you're so well prepared for this. It really shows. I appreciate you took so much time to prep for it, because like I've had a few interviews where they have no idea what I'm talking about, and they think the book is like a policy manual on anti-corruption. They're like, how do we weed out corruption in like, you know, in this specific country that I like? And I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah,
So,
like I don't know. I've never been there.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, but
I specialize in yogurt
Yeah.
in Madagascar.
Exactly.